This is AM Agenda. With me now, the Shadow Communications Minister, Jason Clare. Jason Clare, a lot to talk about. First of all, on the Republic, I see your colleague Jim Chalmers this morning saying that Malcolm Turnbull's a no-conviction politician. This is in the wake of the comments made on the Republic. But isn't Mr Turnbull right that this is not a first-order issue right now? They want the focus on the economy and on reform.
Well, there are two types of politicians. There are politicians who get involved in politics because they want to change things for the better. And there are politicians who run for Parliament just for power. They want to get a job in Parliament, and it's becoming increasingly clear that Malcolm Turnbull is one of those people. Is it the most important issue in Australia at the moment? No. But are we capable of debating a lot of issues at the same time? Yes, of course we are. And I think it's pretty disappointing that Malcolm Turnbull, after arguing for this in the 90s, being a champion for making Australia a republic, now becomes Prime Minister and gets a chance to do something about it and suddenly drops it like it's hot. I think a lot of Australians will be very disappointed with the lack of courage that he showed yesterday.
But isn't it fair to say that most Australians would recognise his credentials on this issue, that they know he's a Republican? He's probably given more to the cause than anyone.
Well, and that's why people will be so disappointed. Malcolm Turnbull's behaving like one of those NASA Saturn rockets at Cape Canaveral, taking off and discarding fuselage as it goes into space. He's discarded his long-held views on an emissions trading scheme, then on gay marriage and the importance of voting for that in the Parliament, and now on the Republic. I think people thought that in Malcolm Turnbull they would get real change. All that's really changed so far is the Prime Minister's letterhead, and that's why I think Australian people are going to be so disappointed.
He's had this position for, as you know, he's had this position for a number of years now, that he believes that the right time would be after the reign of the current monarch. It's not something he whipped up. He whistled up on the spur of the moment yesterday. He's been saying it for years. This is his view. He was the one who gave the most to the cause in the lead up to the referendum in the 90s, and this is his view now. Well,
here's the thing, Kieran. You don't make big change by just waiting for someone to die or just waiting for a date to occur. In 2020, it'll be 250 years since Captain Cook arrived at Botany Bay. But if we want this change to happen, you can't just wait for someone to die or wait for a date to occur. You've got to argue for it. You've got to persuade people. You've got to build momentum. And the most important thing you need if you want Australia to become a republic, if you want to change the Constitution, is you need the leaders of both political parties, the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, to agree and to be prepared to argue for it. Finally, we've got that. We've got a Republican in a Prime Minister and a Republican in the opposition leader, as well as state premiers prepared to argue for this. And when Malcolm Turnbull finally gets the chance to do something about it, he squibs it.
Isn't it fair, though, for him to say, my priority is the economy, this is what I'm about, it's about reform, it's about innovation and growth? And to be honest, it's fair that to ascertain that or assess that most of the electorate that argument will resonate with them. While they might be supportive of Republic down the track, it's not a third or fourth order issue.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull said now pretty clearly he's prepared to argue the case to increase the GST this year, but he's not prepared to argue the case for a Republic. I didn't see him marching in the streets in the 1990s arguing for a GST. He was marching in the streets arguing for Australia to become a republic. But now he's become Prime Minister, and it's not a republic he wants Australia to be. He wants Australians to pay over $8,000 in GST a year if you're an average family. And I think that most Australians will be surprised by that and pretty disappointed.
Now, Tony Abbott speaking at this group in New York, he's copped some flack. His sister said she's disappointed by this decision to speak at an anti-gay, anti-abortion event. Well, this group has that platform. This event is about family values, to be clear. Why is it wrong for Tony Abbott to be speaking to a group of conservatives? We know his position when it comes to same-sex marriage and so on. Isn't it well within his rights to be speaking to Americans on this?
Oh, sure. He can do whatever he likes. I know it's not traffic issues in Warringah, but if he wants to go overseas and speak to groups about his views, then he can certainly do that. Let me say something positive about Tony Abbott. At least he's got the courage of his convictions. A bit like John Howard, love him or loathe him, at least you know where Tony Abbott stands. He did stupid things as Prime Minister, like knight Prince Philip, but it shouldn't have surprised any of us given his long-held views about the monarchy. I think what will surprise and disappoint people is that the person who's replaced him is afraid of his own political party and doesn't have the courage to do the things that he says he's believed in for so long.
Before we move on from the Republic, though, it does beg the question, what about Labor? You've been pro-Republican for years. What did Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard do for 6 years?
Oh, no doubt. We probably could have made the case more firmly and even stronger than we did. As I said earlier, Kieran, this doesn't just happen.
Wouldn't be hard,
because
they didn't do anything.
This doesn't just happen by a date arriving or someone passing away. You've got to argue for it. You've got to build momentum in the community. Peter Fitzsimons spoke to you the other day. He's a great leader of the Republican movement, and I think it's incumbent on all Republicans, Labor, Liberal, Greens, National, whatever, to coalesce and come together, use the opportunity we've got at the moment with two leaders who both support a republic to try and build momentum for this in our community.
The government's apparently looking at some workplace changes. This is for medium-sized companies with more than 20 employees to provide more flexibility for employers to trade off penalty rates for higher wages. If this is something which suits both parties, it opens up more employment. Why will Labor go to a knee-jerk work choices reaction, which inevitably you will?
Well, Kieran, we'll have a look at it. We've said a number of times that if there are ways of simplifying things for small business, then we're willing to look at it and work constructively with the government. But if this is camouflage for cutting workers' wages, we won't. The problem the government has in this area is that nobody trusts it when it comes to workplace relations. Nobody trusts the Liberal Party when it comes to industrial relations because often flexibility is a code word for cutting workers' wages. So if the government brings forward measures which are constructive, which build productivity, which help small business, then we're keen to look at them. But if all they are a mechanism to cut people's wages and cut penalty rates, then we won't support that. We never have and we never will.
Let's look at one final issue, almost out of time, only a minute left, but Apple, the tech giant, announced its global numbers at, I think it's in about 5 minutes from now actually, but we've seen locally they paid $85 million in tax in the last year despite $8 billion in revenue. Hopefully this tax audit comes up with a few more dollars. You
would hope so, wouldn't you? Here's the biggest company in the world that made $8 billion in revenue in Australia, what was it last year, and only paid $85 million in tax. It's extraordinary. The other point I'd make, Kieran, is it's even more extraordinary that this government doesn't have the courage to do something real about it. We've got a proposal in front of the government which would make sure that multinational companies pay $7 billion more in taxation to the Australian people over the next decade, and the government has rejected it out of hand. It should look at that again and do something serious about multinational taxation.
They are. Well, they say that they're already undertaking similar measures and they've been leading the charge on that through the G20.
Well, the legislation that they put through the Parliament, we said, OK, we'll support that, but there's no number next to it about how much revenue it will collect for the Australian people. We've got an additional measure that we've put forward to the government that will raise an additional $7 billion over the next decade for the Australian people from companies like Apple and Google that we think need to pay their fair share of tax in Australia. And the government has said, no, sorry, that's too hard. We're not going to do anything about that. Well, I think that that's pretty disappointing as well. The Australian people will expect better from their political leaders when it comes to doing something serious about multinational taxation.
Jason, Claire, appreciate your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kieran.